I am writing this in the autumn of my life, sitting in a small apartment in Oregon, where no one knows my real name. My hands shake as I hold the pen, not from age, but from the weight of carrying these secrets for nearly 2 decades. Some stories demand to be told even when telling them feels like tearing open old wounds that never properly healed. My name was Eleanor Miller, though everyone called me Ellie. I was 24 years old in the summer of 1958, living in Havenwood, Kansas, when my world collapsed in ways I never could have imagined. What happened that summer taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table, calls you sister, and destroys you with a smile. This is my confession, my testimony, and my warning. It is the story of how an ordinary woman became capable of orchestration, someone's destruction, and how justice and revenge can become the same terrible thing. In 1958, I believed I was living the American dream. Our house on Elm Street was a modest 2-story with white clapboard siding and a picket fence that John painted fresh every spring. The kitchen had yellow curtains I'd sewn myself and a Frigidaire that hummed contentedly in the corner. Our living room held a television set, still a luxury in Havenwood, where John and I would watch I Love Lucy on Tuesday nights, laughing until our sides hurt. I was 7 months pregnant with our first child, a son we planned to name Samuel David Miller. I spent my days preparing his nursery, washing tiny clothes, and dreaming about the family we would become. The baby kicked constantly, as if eager to join our little world, and I would press John's hand to my belly each evening so he could feel his son moving. John worked as a traveling salesman for Henderson Farm Equipment, covering a territory that stretched across 3 counties. He was handsome in that clean-cut way that magazines celebrated, tall and broad-shouldered, with warm brown hair and eyes the color of Kansas sky. More importantly, he was kind. He brought me flowers for no reason, kissed me goodbye every morning, and never raised his voice in anger. We had been married 2 years, and I still felt like the luckiest woman in Havenwood. This was partly because I knew what it felt like to be unwanted. My parents had died in the influenza epidemic of 1943 when I was 9 years old. I spent the remainder of my childhood with my mother's sister, Aunt Margaret, a severe woman who viewed children as burdens and affection as weakness. A woman's worth is measured by how well she can disappear into her husband's life, Aunt Margaret told me repeatedly. Your job is to make his life easier, not to burden him with your needs or opinions. When John proposed to me outside Miller's drugstore in 1956, it was the first time anyone had ever said they couldn't live without me. I clung to his love like a drowning person clings to a life preserver. The thought of losing him, of being alone again, terrified me more than I ever admitted to myself. But there was a shadow in our perfect picture, John's younger brother, Thomas. Thomas Miller was 26, 2 years older than me, and possessed the same handsome features as John, but arranged differently. Where John's face was open and trustworthy, Thomas's was sharp and calculating. He had John's brown hair, but his eyes were a paler blue, and when he smiled, it never quite reached them. Thomas lived alone in a rented house on Maple Street, just 4 blocks from us. He worked sporadically, a few weeks at the grain elevator, a month at Peterson's auto repair, occasional shifts at O'Malley's Tavern. He never seemed to hold any job for long, always finding fault with his supervisors or claiming the work was beneath his capabilities. John felt responsible for his younger brother. Their parents had died in a car accident when Thomas was 19 and still living at home. John, then 21 and newly married to me, had tried to guide Thomas towards stability and responsibility. But Thomas seemed to resent every attempt at help, even as he continued to need it. Tommy's had a hard time finding his place in the world, John would say whenever I expressed concern about his brother's frequent visits or lack of steady employment. He just needs to know his family believes in him. I tried to share John's optimism about Thomas, but something about him made me deeply uncomfortable. When John was home, Thomas was charming and brotherly. He would bring me small gifts, flowers from someone's garden, a magazine from town, a bottle of soda from the drugstore. He would joke with John about their childhood help with yard work, and talk enthusiastically about becoming an uncle. But when John traveled for work, which was typically 3 or 4 days every 2 weeks, Thomas became a different person entirely. His visits during these times felt invasive and wrong. I remember one particular afternoon in early June. I was hanging laundry in our backyard, my movements slow and careful due to my advancing pregnancy. The Kansas heat was already oppressive, and I was looking forward to retreating to the shade of our kitchen. That's when I heard Thomas's voice behind me. "You look beautiful today, Ellie." I turned to find him standing at our back gate watching me with an expression that made my skin crawl. He wasn't looking at my face. "Hello, Thomas," I said politely, continuing to hang John's work shirts on the line. "John's not home. He won't be back until Friday." "I know where John is," Thomas said, opening the gate and stepping into our yard without invitation. "I came to see you." "That's very kind, but I'm quite busy today." Thomas moved close enough that I could smell the pomade in his hair and see the way his eyes lingered on my swollen breasts and the curve of my belly. "You're always busy when I come around," he said softly. "Always finding some excuse to avoid spending time with me? Why is that, Ellie? I'm not avoiding anything. I'm just—" "You know John's gone a lot." Thomas interrupted, his voice taking on a strange, intimate quality. "More than he should be leaving a pregnant wife alone. If you were my woman, I'd never leave you unprotected like that." The way he said, "my woman," made me feel sick. I stepped backward, clutching a damp shirt to my chest like a shield. "I'm perfectly fine on my own, Thomas, and I'm not your woman. I'm your sister-in-law." Thomas's face darkened for just a moment before the charming mask slipped back into place. "Of course you are. I just worry about you, that's all. Family looks out for family." But the damage was done. I had seen something ugly and predatory flash across his features, something that told me his concern was anything but brotherly. That evening, when John called from his hotel in Topeka, I tried to tell him about the encounter. "Thomas stopped by today," I said carefully. He said some things that made me uncomfortable." "What kind of things?" John's voice crackled through the long-distance connection. "He said you travel too much, that you leave me unprotected. And the way he looked at me, John, it didn't feel right." There was a long pause. "Ellie, honey, Thomas is just trying to be a good brother-in-law. He's always been a little awkward around women, but his heart's in the right place." This felt like more than awkwardness. "Law, are you sure you're not just feeling a little sensitive because of the pregnancy? I know your emotions have been all over the place lately." His words stung, even though I knew he didn't mean them to. "I'm not being emotional, John. I'm trying to tell you that your brother makes me uncomfortable." Another pause, and I could hear something that sounded like papers shuffling. "Look, sweetheart, I'll talk to Tommy when I get home. Maybe I can explain that you need your space while you're pregnant. But he's family, Ellie. He's the only family I have left. I can't just cut him out of our lives." After we hung up, I sat in our kitchen for a long time, staring at the yellow curtains I'd been so proud of. For the first time since John had slipped his ring onto my finger, I felt truly alone. The conversation with Thomas would have taken more seriously happened 3 weeks later at the annual 4th of July picnic in Haven Woods Town Park. The whole community gathered every year for an afternoon of games, food, and socializing. I was sitting under a large oak tree fanning myself with a church program and watching John play horseshoes with the other men. From my vantage point, I could see across the park to where the ladies' auxiliary had set up their cake sale booth. I watched Thomas approach Mrs. Carol Abernathy, the wife of Frank Abernathy, John's supervisor at Henderson Farm Equipment. Carol was a nervous, fragile-looking woman in her early 30s. She had pale skin, auburn hair that she kept pulled back in a tight bun, and a way of jumping at sudden sounds. She always seemed to be apologizing for something, even when she'd done nothing wrong. I watched Thomas corner Carol behind the cake booth, speaking to her in urgent, low tones. From the distance, I couldn't hear what he was saying, but Carol's body language told a story of distress. She kept shaking her head, looking around frantically, as if seeking escape or help. Then Thomas grabbed her arm, not gently, and pulled her closer. Carol's face went white, and she reached into her purse with shaking hands. She pulled out what looked like folded bills and pressed them into Thomas's palm. Only then did he release her arm and step back with a satisfied smile. Carol hurried away, smoothing her dress and fixing her hair. When Frank approached her a few minutes later, asking about the success of the cake sale, she managed a bright false smile and chattered nervously about their profits. I should have understood what I was witnessing. I should have recognized the signs of extortion of a predator exploiting his victim. But in 1958, a sheltered young woman from Kansas didn't immediately jump to such dark conclusions. I told myself it must be some private matter. Perhaps Thomas had loaned the Abernathys money, or Carol was paying him for some work he'd done. I was willfully blind because seeing the truth would have meant acknowledging that something was deeply wrong with my husband's beloved brother. And acknowledging that would have threatened the perfect family narrative that was keeping me sane. Tuesday, July 15th, 1958. I can still remember every detail of that morning with crystalline clarity. The way the light slanted through our bedroom curtains, the smell of coffee percolating in the kitchen, the sound of John's whistle as he packed his sample cases into our blue Ford. "This Cleveland trip could change everything, Ellie," John said, kissing my forehead as I stood in the doorway wearing my yellow maternity dress. "Henderson's is finally considering me for that regional manager position. If I get it, you won't have to work after Samuel's born. You can be a full-time mother just like you wanted." I pressed my hand to my swollen belly, feeling our son's restless movements. "I know you'll do wonderfully. Mr. Abernathy already thinks very highly of you." John beamed and kissed me again, deeper this time. "God, I love you, Eleanor Miller. You and that little guy in there are my whole world." "We love you too. Drive safely and call me tonight." "I will. And remember, if you need anything at all, call Thomas. He promised to check on you while I'm gone." I nodded and waved as John drove away, dust swirling behind our car as it disappeared down Elm Street. I didn't know it then, but I would never see my husband's trusting smile again. The day passed slowly. The July heat was brutal by afternoon. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees, and our small house felt like an oven despite the 2 electric fans I had running. I spent most of the day moving between the coolest spots in the house, sewing tiny clothes for Samuel and listening to soap operas on the radio. Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped by around 3 o'clock with a pitcher of lemonade and local gossip. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had taken a motherly interest in me since John and I moved to Elm Street. "You're looking peaked, dear," she said, settling her considerable bulk into our kitchen chair. "This heat isn't good for someone in your condition." "I'm managing," I assured her, grateful for the cool lemonade. "Only 2 more months to go?" "Well, you just remember, if you need anything while John's away, you call me. Harold and I are light sleepers, and we're right next door." After she left, I tried to nap, but found myself too restless. Samuel was particularly active, kicking and shifting as if he could sense my unease. Around 6 o'clock, I made myself a simple dinner of cold ham and sliced tomatoes from our garden. I was too tired and hot to cook anything substantial. As evening approached, I positioned myself on our front porch swing, hoping to catch any hint of a breeze. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but the temperature remained stifling. I was wearing my lightest dress and had my hair pinned up, but sweat still beaded on my forehead and upper lip. That's when I heard the familiar rumble of Thomas's car engine. My heart sank as his black Ford turned into our driveway. He got out carrying a brown paper grocery bag, wearing work clothes, and that easy smile that had fooled everyone in Havenwood except me. "Evening, Ellie," he called out cheerfully. "Thought you might need some supplies. Can't have you carrying heavy bags in your condition." I stood up slowly, using the porch railing for support. At 7 months pregnant, even simple movements required effort. "That's very thoughtful, Thomas, but I went shopping yesterday. I have everything I need." "Well, I'm here now," he said, climbing the porch steps with deliberate casualness. "Might as well bring these in for you. No sense letting good food spoil in this heat." I had no polite way to refuse, so I opened our front door and let him enter. He walked straight to the kitchen and began unpacking groceries, milk, bread, canned peaches, coffee. All items we already had in abundance. "You know, Ellie, Thomas said, opening our icebox to put away the milk. John really is lucky to have you. Not every woman would be so understanding about all his traveling. I remained in the kitchen doorway, every instinct telling me to maintain distance between us. I don't mind, I said carefully. John works hard to provide for our family. Thomas closed the icebox and turned to face me, his pale blue eyes scanning my body in a way that made my skin crawl. Still, it must get lonely. Big house like this all by yourself, especially now when you're so vulnerable. The way he said vulnerable sent ice through my veins despite the oppressive heat. I'm fine, Thomas. Really, I think you should go now. I'm tired and I want to go to bed. That's when his mask finally slipped completely away. Thomas's face transformed from brotherly concern to something cold and calculating. His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. You know what your problem is, Ellie? You think you're better than me. You've always thought that. I don't think anything of the kind. Oh, but you do, Thomas interrupted, moving closer. I instinctively stepped backward into the narrow hallway that connected our kitchen to the front of the house. Ever since John brought you home, you've looked at me like I was something dirty you found on your shoe. Thomas, that's not true. I've always tried to be kind. He laughed, but it was an ugly, bitter sound. You've been polite, Ellie. There's a difference. You've done your wifely duty of tolerating your husband's poor relation, but you've never actually liked me. I was pressed against the wall, now trapped between Thomas and the coat closet door. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to admit the truth, Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I want you to admit that you chose the wrong brother. I love John, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. I've always loved John. Have you? Thomas moved closer, still close enough that I could smell whiskey on his breath and see the rage burning in his pale eyes. Or did you just love what he could give you? The nice house? The respectable husband? The perfect little life? You need to leave, now. You know what really burns me up? Ellie John gets everything. Always has. The good grades in school, the respect around town, the decent job. And now he gets you. He gets to come home to a beautiful wife who worships the ground he walks on. He gets to have a son, his own little legacy to carry on the Miller name. Thomas's voice was getting louder, more agitated. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was something he had been building up to for a long time. And what do I get? He continued. I get the leftovers, the jobs nobody else wants, the women nobody else will have. I get to watch my perfect big brother live the life I should have had. Thomas, please, but not anymore, he said, his eyes dropping to my swollen belly. Tonight, John's going to learn what it feels like to lose something precious. He's going to know what it's like to have his dreams destroyed. I finally understood what he intended, and terror flooded through me like ice water. No, I whispered. Please don't hurt my baby. Please. But Thomas was already reaching for me, and his face held an expression of cold satisfaction that I will see in my nightmares for the rest of my life. What Thomas did to me that night lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but it shattered my world completely. I won't describe the details. Some horrors are too intimate to share, even in a confession meant to reveal all truths. What I will say is that his goal was never to violate me sexually. His goal was to destroy the life growing inside me, to steal John's son and heir as payment for a lifetime of perceived slights. Thomas was methodical about it. He knew exactly how to hurt me without leaving obvious evidence of assault. When I begged him to stop, when I promised I would give him anything he wanted if he would just spare my baby, he smiled. This is what I want, Ellie, he said calmly as I writhed in agony on our hallway floor. I want John to understand what it feels like to have his happiness ripped away from him. When it was over, I lay crumpled against the base of our coat closet, pain radiating through my abdomen and back. I could feel something wet and warm spreading between my legs, and I knew with absolute certainty that Samuel was dying inside me. Thomas stood up and straightened his clothes, looking down at me with satisfaction. "You won't tell anyone about this," he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Because who would believe you? I'm going to go home now and listen to my radio programs. Mrs. Patterson saw me leave Murphy's Diner at 8:30, and Mr. O'Malley will remember me stopping by his tavern around 9. If anyone asks, I went straight home after that and never came near this place." He paused in our doorway, silhouetted against the dying light outside. "Besides Ellie, these things happen all the time. Pregnant women have accidents. They fall downstairs, they lift things that are too heavy. The doctor will call this a tragic but perfectly natural miscarriage. John will be sad for a while, but you're young. You can always try again." After he left, I lay on our floor for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of his car driving away and feeling my son's life ebbing out of me. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional devastation was worse. Thomas had stolen not just Samuel's life, but my faith in safety, in family, in the basic goodness I had always believed existed in the world. I crawled to our kitchen telephone sometime after midnight and called the operator with a voice I barely recognized as my own. "Please," I whispered into the receiver. "I need help. I'm losing my baby." Dr. Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at me, and immediately called for an ambulance. I have only fragmented memories of the ride to Havenwood General, the wail of the siren, the paramedic asking questions I couldn't answer, the bright lights of the hospital emergency room. They couldn't save Samuel. I had known that from the moment I felt the bleeding start, but hearing Dr. Morrison confirm it still felt like a physical blow. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Miller," he said gently. There was nothing we could do. Sometimes these late-term miscarriages just happen. There's no way to predict or prevent them. John arrived 3 hours later, having driven through the night from Cleveland the moment the hospital contacted him. His face, when he saw me, was something I will never forget. Pure terror, followed by a grief so deep it seemed to age him 10 years in an instant. "What happened?" he kept asking, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. "Ellie, what happened?" "You were fine when I left yesterday morning." That's when I told him the truth. All of it. I watched my husband's face carefully as I described Thomas's visit, his threats, and the deliberate attack on our unborn child. For just a moment, maybe 5 seconds, I saw belief in John's eyes. Shock, horror, and a flash of something that might have been recognition, as if he was finally acknowledging suspicions he had been suppressing for years. But then the shutters came down. The idea that his beloved younger brother could be capable of such evil was too threatening to everything John believed about family loyalty and the fundamental goodness of the people he loved. Ellie," he said carefully, his voice taking on the patient tone people use with the mentally unstable. "You've been through a terrible trauma. Sometimes shock can cause hallucinations, false memories. The mind tries to find explanations for things that don't make sense. John, I'm not hallucinating. Thomas came to our house. He told me he was going to take Samuel away from you. He said you always got everything, and it was time you learned what it felt like to lose something precious." John looked at Dr. Morrison, who was standing quietly by my hospital bed. "Doctor, is it possible that the trauma of losing the baby could cause this kind of confusion?" Dr. Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Grief manifests in many ways, Mr. Miller. It's not uncommon for patients to create narratives that help them process inexplicable loss. The mind sometimes needs someone to blame." I felt the world tilting beneath me. "I'm not creating narratives. He was there. He hurt me deliberately." But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in John's eyes hardening into certainty. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. 3 days later, John reluctantly agreed to take me to see Sheriff Brody. I had begged and pleaded until he finally consented, hoping that reporting the incident would help me work through my delusions and accept reality. Sheriff Raymond Brody was a large, red-faced man in his 50s who had held his position for nearly 20 years. He listened to my story with the patronizing patience of someone indulging a hysterical woman, nodding at appropriate intervals and making non-committal sounds. "Mrs. Miller," he said when I finished, "I can see you're in tremendous pain right now. Losing a child is about the worst thing that can happen to a woman. But you're making some very serious accusations against a respected member of our community." "I'm telling you what happened." Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his considerable weight. "Now, ma'am, Thomas Miller is a good man. Maybe he's had some trouble holding down steady work, but he's never been in any real trouble. He goes to church, helps his neighbors, takes care of his family. You're asking me to believe he deliberately attacked his own sister-in-law to kill her unborn child. That's about as evil as a man can get." I could see where this was heading, but I pressed on. "Will you at least question him? Ask him where he was Tuesday night? I'll tell you what I'll do." Sheriff Brody set his tone, suggesting he was being more than generous. "I'll have a friendly conversation with Thomas, just to put your mind at ease. But Mrs. Miller, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this tragedy was exactly what the doctor said, a natural miscarriage that your mind is trying to explain." The friendly conversation lasted all of 10 minutes. Sheriff Brody called John the next day to report that Thomas was real torn up about our loss and had no idea why I would make such terrible accusations. Thomas had indeed been home Tuesday evening listening to the Jack Benny program on his radio. Mrs. Patterson had seen him at Murphy's Diner around 8:30, and several patrons at O'Malley's Tavern remembered him stopping by for a beer around 9 o'clock before heading home. The case was closed before it was ever really opened. The weeks following Samuel's death were the loneliest of my life. John threw himself into work with desperate intensity, accepting every out-of-town assignment Henderson Farm Equipment offered. When he was home, he drank steadily, never enough to be obviously intoxicated, but enough to maintain a constant buffer between himself and reality. We moved around our house like polite strangers. John would ask if I needed anything from town, and I would ask about his work. We slept in the same bed, but might as well have been on different continents. The easy intimacy we had once shared was gone, replaced by a careful distance that hurt more than outright hostility would have. I understood why. Every time John looked at me, he saw his failure to protect his family. Every time I looked at him, I saw his refusal to believe me about Thomas. The love that had once felt so solid now seemed as fragile as spun glass. Thomas, meanwhile, played the role of grieving uncle with Oscar-worthy performance. A week after I came home from the hospital, he appeared at our door with a tuna casserole and a bouquet of daisies from someone's garden. "I brought you some dinner," he said to John, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "I know how hard this has been on both of you. I wanted to do something to help." John's gratitude was heartbreaking to witness. "Tommy, that's so thoughtful. Come in. Ellie will want to thank you." But when Thomas hugged me, a gesture that made my skin crawl, and whispered, "I'm so sorry for your loss, Ellie. If there's anything I can do to help you through this difficult time, you just let me know." I saw something else in his pale eyes. Satisfaction, victory, the knowledge that he had won. Thomas stayed for dinner that night, and he and John talked about their childhood, their parents, anything except the elephant in the room. I sat quietly pushing food around my plate and listening to John's forced laughter at his brother's stories. "You know, Tommy," John said, pouring himself a third glass of whiskey, "having you here means everything to me right now, after what we lost. Well, family is all we really have in this world." Thomas nodded gravely. "That's what family does, John. We take care of each other, always." I excused myself and went to bed early, but I could hear them talking and laughing in the living room until nearly midnight. John was so desperate for normalcy, for proof that his world wasn't completely shattered, that he clung to Thomas's presence like a drowning man clings to debris. That night, lying in bed next to my husband, who had turned away from me in sleep, I realized something fundamental had died inside me, along with Samuel. The trusting, hopeful young woman who had believed that love and goodness would always triumph over evil was gone. What remained was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. If the law wouldn't help me, if my husband wouldn't believe me, then I would have to find another way to make Thomas pay for what he had done. But I was no longer interested in simple justice. I wanted Thomas Miller to suffer the way he had made me suffer. I wanted him to lose everything he valued, to feel the same helpless desperation I felt lying on our hallway floor. And slowly, carefully, I began to plan his destruction. My transformation from grieving victim to calculating predator didn't happen overnight. For the first several weeks after Samuel's death, I was still too shattered to think clearly about anything. I moved through my days in a haze of grief and rage, barely eating, sleeping fitfully, jumping at every unexpected sound. But as July turned to August, and August began to wane, something crystallized inside me. It started with small observations, the way Thomas's smile never reached his eyes, the careful way he established alibis for his whereabouts, the satisfaction I glimpsed when he thought no one was looking. I began watching him with the methodical patience of a scientist studying a particularly loathsome specimen. At first, my surveillance was clumsy and obvious. I would park our Ford across from his house on Maple Street, trying to look casual while noting his comings and goings. More than once, I nearly got caught. Thomas would glance in my direction, and I would have to duck down or pretend to be looking for something in the glove compartment. Gradually, I became more sophisticated. I learned his routines, identified the best vantage points, and developed plausible excuses for being in various locations around town. Thomas left his house every morning at 9 o'clock sharp. He usually went to Murphy's Diner for breakfast, where he flirted shamelessly with the waitresses and read the Topeka newspaper. Then he would drive to whatever job he was working that week. In late August, he was loading freight at the railroad depot. But it was Thomas's evenings that truly interested me. After work, he would often go to O'Malley's Tavern, a rough establishment on the south side of town, where respectable women never set foot. Through the grimy windows, I could see him in the back room playing cards with other men who looked like they settled disputes with their fists rather than words. Thomas was clearly a regular gambler, and from his body language, the way his shoulders hunched when he lost, the way he argued with other players when the cards went against him, he wasn't very good at it. One evening in early September, I followed him when he left O'Malley's. Instead of heading home to Maple Street, he drove to an abandoned Texaco station on the outskirts of town. A black Cadillac was waiting there, and my heart began pounding when I saw the man who got out. Even from my hiding spot behind a billboard, I could tell this wasn't a friendly conversation. The well-dressed man, who I later learned was named Silas Carmichael, grabbed Thomas by his shirt collar and shoved him against the side of his car. Thomas was nodding frantically, his hands raised in a pleading gesture that made him look pathetic and desperate. When Carmichael finally released him, Thomas fumbled in his wallet and handed over what looked like money. It clearly wasn't enough, because Carmichael shook his head and said something that made Thomas's face go white with terror. Then Carmichael got back in his Cadillac and drove away, leaving Thomas standing alone in the gathering darkness. I had found Thomas's weakness. He was in debt to dangerous people, and from the fear on his face, he was running out of time to pay them back. But I needed more than just knowledge of his gambling problems. I needed something that would expose him for what he truly was, something that would make everyone in Havenwood see the monster hiding behind his charming facade. The answer came to me 3 weeks later, purely by chance. In mid-September, Thomas claimed his landlord was doing extensive repairs and asked if he could stay in our guest room for a few nights. John, ever eager to help his struggling younger brother, immediately agreed, despite my obvious discomfort. Having Thomas sleeping under our roof was torture. I cooked his meals, washed his dishes, and made polite conversation while fighting the urge to scream every time he looked at me. But I endured it because I sensed an opportunity. Thomas was comfortable in our house, relaxed and off guard. If he had secrets, this might be my chance to discover them. On the second morning of his stay, after both men had left for work, I decided to clean the guest room thoroughly. I stripped the bed, dusted the furniture, and was preparing to vacuum when my hand brushed against something hard under the mattress. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small black leather ledger, the kind shopkeepers use to track customer accounts. My hands were trembling as I opened it, though I didn't yet understand why. Inside were pages of meticulous handwriting in Thomas's careful script. Names of women, dates, and dollar amounts. Next to each entry was a single word: insurance, discretion, silence, or cooperation. The names hit me like physical blows. Mrs. Janet Morrison, the doctor's wife. Miss Sarah Coleman, the unmarried school teacher. Mrs. Ruth Patterson, our elderly neighbor. Mrs. Barbara Henderson from the farm supply store. And there on the third page was the name that made everything click into horrifying place: Mrs. Carol Abernathy. Next to Carol's name was a date from June, just 2 weeks before the 4th of July picnic, where I had witnessed their strange interaction, and the notation: promotion leverage, $50 monthly ongoing. I sat on our guest room floor staring at that ledger as pieces of a larger puzzle fell into place. Thomas wasn't just a desperate gambler in debt to loan sharks. He was a systematic predator who used blackmail to fund his addiction. The attack on me hadn't been an isolated incident born of jealousy. It was part of a pattern of deliberately destroying women's lives for his own benefit. Carol Abernathy's nervous behavior at the picnic. The way she had handed Thomas money behind the cake booth with shaking hands. Her pale, frightened face when her husband approached. Thomas had seduced or compromised Carol somehow, then used her shame and fear to blackmail her. And when John was being considered for the regional manager position, Thomas had used his leverage over Carol to ensure her husband would pass John over for the promotion. He wasn't just jealous of John's success, he was actively sabotaging it while pretending to be a loving, supportive brother. The attack on me had been Thomas's nuclear option, his final attempt to destroy John's happiness when subtler methods weren't enough. For the first time since Samuel's death, I felt something other than grief and helplessness. I felt cold, focused rage that burned through me like acid. This wasn't just about justice for me anymore. It was about justice for Carol Abernathy, for every woman whose name was written in that black book of horrors, for every future victim Thomas would claim if he wasn't stopped. I carefully photographed each page of the ledger using John's camera, my hands steady, despite the fury coursing through my veins. Then I returned the book to its hiding place under the mattress. Thomas would never know I had found his insurance policy until it was far too late to save himself. With the ledger as my roadmap, I began planning Thomas's destruction with the same methodical care he had used to plan mine. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies' information and resources that a housewife in 1950s Kansas couldn't easily obtain on her own. My first call was to information requesting the number for private investigators in Topeka. I chose a city far enough away that word wouldn't filter back to Havenwood. When I finally worked up the courage to make contact, I told the investigator, a man named Pete Kowalski, that I suspected my husband of having an affair and needed proof for potential divorce proceedings. It was a lie, but it was the kind of case private investigators handled regularly without asking too many questions. "I need you to investigate a man named Silas Carmichael," I told Pete during our first telephone conversation, my voice carefully modulated to sound like a suspicious wife rather than a woman plotting revenge. "I believe he's connected to my husband's extracurricular activities. I need to know everything about his business operations, his associates, and his methods of collecting debts." Pete charged me $50 up front and promised results within 2 weeks. I paid him with money I had been secretly saving from our household budget quarters, skimmed from grocery money dimes, saved from my weekly allowance accumulated over months of careful planning. While I waited for Pete's report, I began my own investigation into Carol Abernathy's situation. This required delicate work. I couldn't simply approach her directly. She was clearly too frightened and trapped to trust anyone, especially another woman who might judge her for whatever Thomas was using against her. Instead, I made it a point to shop in town on the same days Carol typically ran her errands. I would position myself in Henderson's general store or Miller's drugstore, where I could observe her interactions without being obvious about it. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions about Thomas's methods. Carol Abernathy was a woman living in constant terror. She jumped at sudden noises, looked over her shoulder frequently while walking down Main Street, and seemed to be counting every penny she spent. Once I saw her at the cosmetics counter in Henderson's, carefully examining face powder that I realized she was using to cover what looked like fingerprint bruises on her upper arms. The picture became even clearer when I overheard a conversation between Carol and Mrs. Henderson at the checkout counter. "I'm sorry, Carol, but your account is past due again," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, trying to be discreet. "I can't extend any more credit until you make a payment on your current balance." Carol's face flushed with shame. "I understand, Mrs. Henderson. I'll have the money by next week, I promise. Frank's been having some unexpected expenses lately." But I had seen Frank Abernathy at First National Bank that same week, making what appeared to be a substantial deposit from the Henderson Farm Equipment account. The Abernathys weren't poor. Carol was being forced to divert household money to Thomas, leaving her unable to pay even basic bills. 2 weeks later, Pete Kowalski called with his report on Silas Carmichael, and what he told me made my blood run cold. "Your instincts were right, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had seen too much of humanity's dark side. "Carmichael runs a loan operation out of Kansas City. He lends money to gamblers, small-time criminals, and desperate people who can't get credit anywhere legitimate. His interest rates are well beyond legal limits, and his collection methods are unpleasant." "What kind of collection methods?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Broken bones for the first warning. Destroyed property for the second. After that, people tend to disappear permanently. Word on the street is that Carmichael is losing patience with several local debtors who are significantly behind on their payments." My heart began racing. "Is Thomas Miller one of those debtors?" There was a pause. "How did you know that name? I didn't mention him in my report." "Lucky guess," I said quickly. "How much does he owe?" "According to my sources, Miller owes Carmichael approximately $800 in principal plus interest. That's compounding weekly at rates that would make a Chicago mobster blush. That's more money than most working men in Kansas see in 6 months. If he doesn't pay soon, he's going to have very serious problems." $800. It was a fortune in 1958, more than John made in 3 months of traveling sales. Thomas was desperate, which made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Desperate men make desperate choices, and desperate choices often lead to fatal mistakes. I thanked Pete and hung up my mind, already working on the final, most crucial phase of my plan. The last Sunday in September arrived with dark clouds building on the horizon and the heavy electric feeling that precedes a violent thunderstorm. I had been planning this day for weeks, and every piece was finally in place. I woke before dawn and began cooking what would be the most important meal of my life. Roast beef with vegetables, fresh dinner rolls, green bean casserole, and apple pie for dessert. I wanted everything to be perfect, because this would be the last time Thomas Miller would sit at a table as a free man. When John came downstairs for breakfast, I was already dressed in my best blue dress, with my hair carefully styled and my makeup applied with unusual care. "You look beautiful this morning," he said, kissing my cheek with more warmth than he had shown in months. "What's the occasion?" "I've been thinking about what you said," I replied, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "About how I need to let go of my anger and try to heal our family. I think you're right." John's face lit up with hope, the first genuine emotion I had seen from him since Samuel's death. "Really, you mean that I want to have Thomas over for dinner tonight. I want to apologize to him for the terrible things I said after we lost the baby. I want our family to be whole again." The relief in John's eyes was almost heartbreaking. For weeks, he had been carrying the weight of choosing between his wife and his brother, and I was finally offering him a way to have both. "Ellie, that's wonderful. I know Thomas will appreciate it. He's been so worried about you about us." "I'm sure he has," I thought, but I kept my expression loving and sincere. "Will you call him this morning and invite him? Tell him it's important to me that he comes. 6 o'clock sharp." John agreed immediately. He was so grateful to see any sign of the old Ellie returning that he would have agreed to almost anything. After John made the call and confirmed that Thomas would indeed be joining us for dinner, I began making my own calls the most important conversations of my entire plan. First, I called the Abernathy house. Frank answered on the third ring, and I put on my sweetest, most innocent voice. "Mr. Abernathy, this is Eleanor Miller, John's wife. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Of course not, Mrs. Miller. How are you holding up? John mentioned you've been having a difficult time since your loss." "I'm doing much better, thank you for asking. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. John and I are having a small dinner party tonight to celebrate some wonderful news, and we would be honored if you and Mrs. Abernathy could join us." There was a pause. "I'm not sure I understand. What wonderful news?" "Oh, didn't John tell you?" I said, injecting just the right amount of surprise into my voice. "He's been offered the regional manager position. He's supposed to give his final answer tomorrow morning. We thought it would be nice to celebrate with the people who made it possible." Another longer pause. I could practically hear Frank Abernathy's confusion through the telephone line. John hadn't been offered any promotion. In fact, he had been passed over for the position 3 weeks ago, though Frank hadn't found the courage to deliver that news directly. "Mrs. Miller, I think there might be some confusion." "Please say you'll come," I interrupted sweetly. It would mean so much to John to have his mentor there to share in our happiness. 6 o'clock at our house on Elm Street. I'm making his favorite roast beef dinner. Frank Abernathy was too much of a gentleman to refuse directly, especially when he was clearly confused about what was happening. "Well, I suppose we could stop by for a few minutes." "Wonderful. We'll see you then." My second call was to a payphone number in Kansas City that Pete Kowalski had provided a number that would connect me directly to Silas Carmichael's organization. When a gruff voice answered, I disguised my own voice and spoke quickly. "I have information about one of your clients," I said. "Thomas Miller in Havenwood. He's planning to skip town tonight with a large sum of money he's been hiding from you. If you want to collect what he owes, you need to be at 412 Elm Street at 7 o'clock tonight. He'll be there with the money." I hung up before the voice could ask any questions. The trap was set. All the pieces were in place. By tomorrow morning, Thomas Miller would be exposed as the predator he truly was, and justice of a sort would finally be served. At exactly 6 o'clock, Thomas knocked on our front door with the confident rhythm of a man who believed he owned the world. He was wearing his best shirt and had slicked his brown hair back with pomade until it gleamed. He carried a bottle of wine that he had undoubtedly charmed from someone else, and wore that devastating smile that had fooled everyone in Havenwood except me. "Ellie, he said, kissing my cheek as he entered our house. "You look absolutely lovely tonight. I'm so glad to see you're feeling better." The touch of his lips on my skin made me want to recoil, but I forced myself to smile warmly. "Thank you, Thomas." I wanted to apologize for the awful things I said after we lost Samuel. I wasn't thinking clearly. Of course you weren't," Thomas replied, his pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Grief can make people say things they don't mean. I never held it against you, Ellie. Your family." John appeared from the kitchen, beaming with happiness, and the two brothers embraced warmly. "I'm so proud of you for doing this," John whispered in my ear as Thomas hung up his coat. "This is exactly what our family needs." The Abernathys arrived 20 minutes later, looking confused and uncomfortable. Carol looked particularly anxious, her eyes darting between Thomas and me, as if trying to solve a puzzle she didn't quite understand. She was wearing a long-sleeved dress despite the warm evening, and I noticed the way she unconsciously touched her upper arms, covering bruises, no doubt. "Frank, Carol, thank you so much for coming on such short notice," I said, taking their coats with genuine warmth. "Please come sit in the living room while I put the finishing touches on dinner." As we settled into our small living room, Frank Abernathy cleared his throat uncomfortably. "John, I have to admit I'm a bit confused about this celebration. I'm not sure what promotion Mrs. Miller was referring to when she called." John looked puzzled and turned to me. "Promotion, Ellie? What did you tell Mr. Abernathy?" Before I could answer, there was a sharp knock at our front door, 3 quick raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and threatening. "Excuse me," I said, rising smoothly. "That must be our other dinner guests." I opened the door to find 2 large men in cheap but clean suits standing on our porch. The older one had cold, dead eyes and silver hair slicked back from his forehead. When he smiled, it was the smile of a shark. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, politely removing his hat. "I'm Silas Carmichael, and this is my associate, Mr. Frank. We're here to see Thomas Miller. We understand he's having dinner with you tonight." "Of course," I replied, stepping aside with perfect hospitality. "Please come into the living room. Thomas is right here." The moment Thomas saw Silas, every drop of color drained from his face. He shot to his feet so quickly that he knocked over his wineglass red liquid spreading across our coffee table like spilled blood. "Silas!" Thomas stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "What are you doing here? How did you—" "Funny thing, Tommy." Silas interrupted, his voice remaining calm and conversational despite the obvious tension in the room. "I received some very interesting information this afternoon. Someone called to tell me you were planning to leave town tonight with money that rightfully belongs to me." Frank Abernathy stood up, clearly alarmed by the dangerous undercurrent in the room. "I think Carol and I should go. This seems like a private family matter." "Actually, Mr. Abernathy," I said quietly, "I think you should stay. This concerns you and your wife as well." Thomas was looking around frantically now, like a trapped animal seeking any possible escape. His eyes landed on me, and I saw the exact moment he realized what was happening, who had orchestrated this perfect storm of destruction. "You," he whispered, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You did this. You called them." "Did what, Thomas?" I asked, innocently, settling back into my chair with perfect composure. That's when Thomas completely lost what remained of his self-control. Cornered, desperate, and facing exposure on multiple fronts simultaneously, he made the fatal decision to try discrediting me by revealing the truth he thought would destroy my credibility. "She's been planning this," he shouted, his voice becoming shrill and hysterical. "She's been crazy ever since she lost that baby, the baby I had to kill." The room went dead silent. Even Silas Carmichael looked genuinely surprised by the confession. Thomas realized what he had said, but it was far too late to take the words back. They hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. "I had to do it," he continued, his voice becoming even more unhinged as he saw the horror on every face in the room. "John always got everything. The good job, the perfect wife, the nice house, everyone's respect. He was going to have a son, his own little prince, to carry on the precious Miller name, and I was going to be left with nothing again." John's face was a canvas of pure devastation. "Tommy," he whispered, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying I went to your house that night and made sure she lost that baby." Thomas screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I'm saying John deserved to lose something for once in his charmed life. I'm saying I'm glad I killed your precious son, because now you know what it feels like to have your dreams destroyed." Carol Abernathy suddenly found her voice speaking for the first time since entering our house. Her words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst inside her. "He's been blackmailing me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "For months. He forced himself on me back in June, then threatened to tell Frank I had seduced him unless I paid him to keep quiet. He said no one would believe it wasn't consensual and that it would ruin Frank's career. Frank stared at his wife in shock. Carol, why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. And because he said he would destroy everything you'd worked for if I didn't cooperate. He made me convince you not to promote John. He said if you gave John the regional manager position, he would tell everyone in town that your wife was a whore who had corrupted an innocent young man. The final pieces of Thomas's web of destruction were now visible to everyone in the room. He hadn't just murdered my child out of jealousy, he had systematically sabotaged his brother's career while blackmailing and abusing other women to fund his gambling addiction. Silas Carmichael, who had been listening to this domestic drama with growing impatience, stepped forward and grabbed Thomas by the arm with casual efficiency. This is all very interesting, he said, but I'm here about money, not family problems. Tommy, you owe me $847 as of today, including compound interest. Do you have it? Thomas looked around the room desperately, seeing nothing but horrified faces and closed doors. I can get it. Give me 1 more week and I can— You've had 8 months, Silas interrupted. Time's up. He nodded to his associate, who grabbed Thomas's other arm. Together they began dragging him toward our front door, despite his increasingly frantic struggles. Wait! Thomas screamed, looking back at me with pure, undiluted hatred burning in his pale eyes. She planned this whole thing. She set me up. She's not the innocent victim she pretends to be. She's a calculating, cold-blooded— The front door slammed shut, cutting off his words. Through our living room window, I watched Silas's black Cadillac disappear into the night, with Thomas Miller inside it. I would never see him alive again. After Thomas was taken away, a heavy silence fell over our living room, like a funeral shroud. Frank Abernathy was staring at his wife with a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and dawning understanding. Carol was weeping quietly into her hands. John sat in his favorite chair, his face pale with shock, staring at the spot where his brother had been standing, as if he could still see him there. I moved through the wreckage of our dinner party like a gracious hostess offering coffee and attempting to restore some semblance of normalcy to a situation that had gone far beyond anything normal or decent. Carol spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning. Frank's voice was hoarse when he finally responded. How long, Carol? How long has this been going on? Since June. It started right before you were supposed to make the decision about John's promotion. Thomas, he said terrible things about what people would think if they knew. He said I had led him on, that it was my fault for being friendly to him. He said no one would believe I hadn't wanted it to happen. Frank closed his eyes as if in physical pain. So he used you to sabotage John's career? Yes. I'm so sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry, John. I never wanted any of this to happen. John looked up at his boss with confused, wounded eyes. I don't understand. What promotion? What decision? Frank sighed heavily, looking every one of his 53 years. John, you were supposed to be offered the regional manager position 3 months ago. The decision was made in May, right after your excellent quarterly reports from the eastern counties. But then, well, certain concerns were raised about your family's stability. I was told there had been incidents suggesting your wife might be emotionally unstable, and that it wouldn't be appropriate to promote someone whose home life was in chaos. The room spun around me as the full scope of Thomas's manipulation became clear. He had not only murdered my child and blackmailed Carol, he had also systematically destroyed John's professional reputation by spreading rumors about my mental state after the miscarriage. John turned to look at me with eyes full of questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. Ellie, how did you know to invite the Abernathys tonight? How did you know about Silas Carmichael? How did you know any of this would happen? There was no point in lying anymore. The truth was going to come out whether I confessed it or not. Because I've been investigating Thomas for months, I said quietly. I found his blackmail ledger hidden in our guest room. I hired a private investigator to research his gambling debts. I orchestrated everything that happened here tonight. John stared at me as if I were a complete stranger. You planned all of this. Thomas murdered our son John. He confessed to it in front of witnesses. He's been systematically destroying your career and reputation while pretending to love and support you. He's been blackmailing and abusing other women to pay for his gambling addiction. Someone had to stop him. But how did you know he would confess? How could you have predicted that? Because I understand what kind of man he is better than you ever did. When bullies are cornered, they always reveal their true nature. Thomas couldn't resist bragging about what he'd done to me, especially when he thought it might discredit me and save his own skin. Frank Abernathy stood up and helped his wife to her feet. We should go home now and discuss this privately. John, I'll call you tomorrow morning. We need to talk about your future with the company, your real future now that we understand what actually happened. After the Abernathys left, John and I sat alone in our living room for the first time in months. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The smell of the roast beef dinner I had prepared still hung in the air, a grotesque mockery of the family celebration it was supposed to have been. I don't know who you are anymore, John finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm the woman whose baby was murdered while her husband chose to believe his brother's lies instead of her truth. I replied with a calmness that surprised even me. John flinched as if I had slapped him. I wanted to believe you, Ellie. God knows I wanted to. But Thomas was my brother. He was all the family I had left after our parents died. The idea that he could do something so evil. And Samuel was your son. He was innocent, and he's dead because of your brother's jealousy and your blind loyalty to family over truth. So you took justice into your own hands. Yes, I did. Because no one else would. Because the law failed me, you failed me, and if I hadn't acted, Thomas would have continued hurting people until someone finally stopped him permanently. John was quiet for a long time, staring into his whiskey glass, as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. What happens now? He finally asked. Now, you can have the regional manager position that should have been yours months ago. Frank Abernathy knows the truth about why you were passed over. Thomas can never hurt your career again. I meant what happens to us, Ellie. What happens to our marriage? I looked at my husband, this man I had once loved more than my own life, and felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness where my heart used to be. There is no us anymore, John. There hasn't been since the night you chose to believe Thomas over me. Since the night you decided that keeping peace with your brother was more important than justice for your son. I went to our bedroom and packed a single suitcase with my clothes and a few personal belongings. I left the photographs, the wedding gifts, the accumulated memories of our life together. They all belonged to a different woman, a naive, trusting girl who had believed that love could protect her from the world's cruelty. When I returned to the living room, John was still sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. Where will you go? He asked without looking up. Away from here. Away from you. Away from all the memories that used to be beautiful and are now just reminders of everything we lost. I placed my wedding ring on the mantelpiece next to the photograph of John and me on our wedding day. We looked so young and hopeful in that picture, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. Goodbye, John. I set my hand on the front door. I hope someday you can forgive yourself for choosing the wrong brother. I walked out into the storm that had finally broken over Havenwood, Kansas, and never looked back. I am writing these final words in a small apartment in Millfield, Oregon, where I have lived under the name Helen Price for nearly 17 years. I work as a librarian at the local elementary school, surrounded by children's laughter and stories that end happily. It is a quiet life, a careful life, built on the foundation of secrets I have never shared with another living soul. For all these years, I heard nothing from Havenwood. I had no contact with anyone from my former life, and I preferred it that way. The woman who had orchestrated Thomas Miller's destruction was someone I tried very hard to forget, though she haunted my dreams and shaped my every waking moment. Then last month, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from Mary Miller John's sister, forwarded through a chain of old addresses until it finally found me. She was writing to inform me that John had died of a heart attack 6 weeks earlier. He had never remarried, had become something of a recluse after I left drinking heavily and avoiding most social contact with the people of Havenwood. The news of John's death should have brought me closure, or at least a sense of completion. Instead, it opened wounds I thought had healed decades ago. But it was Mary's final paragraphs that stopped my heart and forced me to confront the full truth of what had happened that September night in 1958. She wrote that in the months before his death, John had begun talking about the past in ways he never had before. The alcohol had loosened his tongue, and old guilts had begun eating away at what remained of his peace of mind. According to Mary, John had confessed something to her during one of his darker moments, something that revealed a truth I had never suspected, never even imagined. After the Abernathys had left our house that night, after I had gone upstairs to pack my belongings, John had sat alone in our living room listening to the sound of the storm outside. He had watched through our front window as Silas Carmichael's men dragged his brother away into the darkness, and then, consumed by a rage and grief that had been building inside him for months, he had picked up our telephone and made one final anonymous call to Silas Carmichael's organization. John told them that not only was Thomas planning to skip town with money that belonged to them, but that Thomas had been bragging about a briefcase full of blackmail cash hidden in the trunk of his Ford Money he planned to use to start a new life somewhere far from Kansas. It was a lie, of course. Thomas had no such money. But it was the kind of lie that would ensure his death rather than just a beating or intimidation. My husband, my good, kind, loyal husband who had chosen his brother over me, had ultimately been the one to seal Thomas's fate. I had loaded the weapon and aimed it with surgical precision, but John had been the one to pull the trigger. Thomas Miller's body was found in the Kansas River 3 days after our dinner party. The Topeka newspaper reported it as a mob killing related to gambling debts, and Sheriff Brody conducted what could charitably be described as a perfunctory investigation before closing the case. No arrests were ever made. As I sit here now writing by the light of a small desk lamp in my lonely apartment, I finally understand the complete truth of what happened that September night. The tragedy of Samuel's death hadn't just broken me or revealed Thomas as the monster he always was, it had corrupted all of us in different ways. I had become a calculating instrument of vengeance, capable of orchestrating a man's destruction with terrifying precision. Thomas had revealed himself as a predator who destroyed innocent lives for profit and pleasure. And John, my gentle, trusting John, had discovered that even fundamentally good men are capable of murder when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. We were all transformed by evil that summer. The only question was whether we became monsters in the service of justice, or whether justice itself had become monstrous in our hands. I got my revenge. Thomas Miller paid for his crimes in the most final way possible. But the price was higher than I ever could have imagined when I began my careful, methodical campaign of destruction. I lost my husband, my home, my identity, and any hope of the family I had dreamed of building. John lost his faith in family, his peace of mind, and ultimately his will to live. Even Carol Abernathy, freed from Thomas's blackmail, moved away from Havenwood with her husband, rather than face the whispers and speculation that would have followed her for the rest of her life. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Samuel, the son I never got to hold, never got to raise, never got to see, become the man he might have been. I wonder if he would have approved of what I did in his name, or if he would have been horrified by the violence I unleashed to avenge his death. I wonder if there might have been another way, a path that would have brought justice without destroying everyone it touched. But I suspect I will never know the answer to that question. What I do know is this: when you fight monsters, you must be very careful not to become one yourself. And when you stare too long into the abyss of human evil, the abyss begins to stare back into you. The summer of 1958 was supposed to be the beginning of my real life as a wife and mother. Instead, it became the summer that taught me how thin the line is between justice and revenge, between righteousness and ruthlessness. This is my confession. This is my truth. And this is my warning to anyone who reads these words. Be very careful what price you're willing to pay for justice, because you might discover that the cost is higher than you can bear. Some victories taste like ashes in your mouth. Some forms of justice leave everyone involved diminished and damaged beyond repair. And sometimes, when you finally get everything you thought you wanted, you realize that what you've really won is a lifetime of regret. I am 71 years old now, and I have carried these secrets for nearly 2 decades. They have shaped every day of my life, influenced every relationship I might have formed, colored every moment of joy or peace I might have experienced. Tomorrow, I will mail this memoir to the Topeka Capital Journal with instructions that it be published exactly 1 year after my death. By the time anyone reads these words, I will be gone, and the last witness to the complete truth of what happened in Havenwood, Kansas, will finally be at rest. May God forgive us all for what we became that summer, and may the dead finally find the peace that we, the living, have never been able to achieve.